Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Fun Times Quest. This is Fred, and we're getting ready to get back on this Lincoln Versailles. I know it's been a while, but it's been pretty busy around here. But now I got a little bit of break, and we're going to take a look and see if we can figure out how to get this thing running. And the last time we looked at it, I said that we had to look at the ignition system. There's a few things going on with there and that. So we're going to do a quick visual inspection again, just to refresh on what it was that I seen that was might be a problem trying to get this thing started and that. So here we are looking in the engine bay of this thing. It's got a 302 in it and that. But one main thing you can see is that we're missing the wire coming from off the distributor going directly into the coil right here and that. So I need to get one of those. I got one laying around. I'm just going to throw on it just for testing purposes and that. And then we can also see the coil has these two wires that have been cut. So the connector for it is actually missing and that. So we need to figure out where does that actually have to go to and that. And I think here's our connector that it actually needs to connect to over here. The only thing is there's actually 3 wires coming into this connector, so we need to figure out where that third wire goes. But the colors are pretty clear on it, so you can see a pink, looks like a red and a green one here, and then we got a red and a green here, or maybe that's the pink one too. So, but since we need to figure out what goes where, we're going to get all on shop key and see on the wiring diagram where everything's supposed to connect to and how it's supposed to connect up and that, because that coil needs constant power, and it also needs ground that actually switches on and off and that. So I'm going to look up what we need to see on the wiring diagram, and then we'll probably go to the whiteboard and I'll explain a little bit on how these ignition systems work, so you can figure out how to test them correctly to get things running, to see if it's a coil problem, a power problem, or maybe you just need to check the distributor and that. So, all right. All right, so I got done looking at chop key and found out that the wires going to the coil are a red wire with a green stripe for power and a green with a yellow stripe for ground. And that, so the power has come from the ignition switch to be able to turn the coil on and off, and that, and then the ground on this one actually goes to an ignition module that is mounted to the fender of the vehicle and that. I did not realize that these things actually had variable timing, electronic variable timing with it. On most distributors, they had vacuum and also weights that vary the timing going down the road and that, and so they worked pretty good on older vehicles and stuff. But this one here in '79, they started using electronic variable timing on these vehicles. Very, very unique and that. So I was kind of flabbergasted when I seen that. So this ignition module actually looked at an intake air temp sensor and also the throttle position sensor and a crank sensor to know what the timing needed to be depending on the situation and that. And that's stuff that you don't see until later on in the 90s, was the variable timing through the ignition module. And that is, you don't see those type of sensors on these older cars that had the old distributor system on it and that. So very interesting in that. But the main thing is it still works just like a regular ignition distributor without the ignition module. You still had power going to the coil, and you still had a ground for the coil that is switched on and off to be able to fire the spark plugs and that. So here, when we turn the key on, there should be constant power coming to it. So when I go over there to the vehicle, I'm going to test to make sure I actually have constant power when I turn the key on. And then when I come to the green yellow, when we start cranking the engine, I want to see that the ground is actually turned on and off and not just constant and that. So because when the ground is turned off is when this actually sparks and that, and gives the high voltage to the distributor, to the spark plug, and fires then you know the big explosions and all that happen due to that. So yeah, so that's what I'm going to be looking for diagnostics. Now the third wire, that's in there, it's the red wire. It actually gives power to a carb solenoid, and that I didn't look at the research it that much, but just guessing, I'm guessing the carb solenoid would be for if you turn the AC system on. It actually had a solenoid that pushed out and bumped up the RPM a little bit on the carburetor to keep the vehicle from dying when you had the AC compressor kick on, because the AC compressor causes a little bit more load on the vehicle and could have killed the engine if it got too low in that. So that's what that third wire is for. So I don't have to worry about that one, but I do need to worry about the one with the red green and the green yellow one in that. So we're going to go back to the car and we're going to do a little bit of testing to see if everything's working the way it should and that. So I'm probably going to end up cutting that connector off and just running temporary wires for testing purposes only. But once we figure out how if everything's working the way it should, I will actually do a permanent way of connecting everything up instead of just temporary and that, because I'm not going to send it down the road you know, and have it to where it's only temporary stuff and that. Yeah, it's this is shoddy work. You want to make sure that you make all the connections good. I'll probably put a different type of plug in there too if everything is working the way it should and that. But it's very interesting to see, you know, if this ignition module actually still works and that. So all right, let's go to the vehicle and check it out. All right, so we're back here on the Lincoln and I already got everything hooked up. So where this white wire is our positive power going to the ignition coil, and then our ground for ignition coil goes to the jumper wire here, and that which goes over here to the ignition module, which is that Duralast and that tested tough, as they say. And that so when we start cranking it, the ignition module over here in the corner should actually start pulsing the ground to be able to fire the ignition coil for spark to actually happen. I actually took a coil wire, came up to a spark tester, and that, which is nice, and that has to be hooked to a good ground, so I had to kind of scrape it a little bit to make sure that it was grounded really good. So when I go to crank it, it should spark between those two spots right there and that. So to be able to crank it, I made it a lot easier on myself so I don't have to turn the key. I came over here on this Lincoln. It has the starter solenoid up here on the fender and that. So I got this here button that I can push and it'll send power to the S terminal of the solenoid here and turn it on and give power to the starter and that. So now when we get all this set up, I want to make sure before I start cranking that there's actually power going to the coil and that. So I took this here test light and I got hooked to ground on the battery, and I'm going to test it to make sure there's power at the coil and that. So to make sure that happens, you got to have the ignition key on and on position and that. So then I also want to put this over here on the ground side of the coil, and it's still going to be on just because the ground is not actually on right now over there in the ignition module and that. So when I start cranking, not only should it spark here and that also should pulse on and off. So every time the ground turns on, that light should go out, and then when the ground turns off, it should spark down here, and that light should turn back on and that. So it should just sit there and pulse on and off as it's cranking, telling me the ignition module is actually doing its job and that. And just to verify that, I put the spark tester on there too and that. So let's go ahead and give her a quick crank, see what happens. So as you see, there's no pulsation at all, and it didn't spark at the tester at all and that. So just to verify that the ignition coil is actually good and not bad, I'm actually going to take the ground here and I'm going to actually do what the ignition module's job should do and turn the ground on and off, and it should spark. So as you can see, you can hear it spark and you can see it sparking. So it tells me that my ignition coil is actually good and the ignition module is actually not doing its job and that. So I need to replace that. Now the thing is, I already did the research on this, and the ignition module you can actually get, and it's almost $300 for it and that. But the thing that tells the ignition module to do its job to turn things on and off is the crank sensor, which you cannot get a crank sensor. So instead of doing that and paying $200 or almost $300 for an ignition module over here, I'm going to eliminate that, buy a new distributor, or instead of having a separate ignition module over here in the corner, the ignition module is going to be inside the distributor, and it's only going to be about $200 for the whole distributor module and everything and stuff. So yeah, gotta order that from Summit and that. So that, you know, I always like going up to Summit. It's only 2 hours from here and that, but this time I'm just gonna order and have them send it and ship it. I don't have time to run up to Summit and wander around right now. So I guess that's it for now until we get the new distributor, and then I'll show you guys how to actually drop in the distributor and make sure that it all fires like it should and that. So now just a heads up for you Ford guys, you're not going to be happy with the type of distributor that I'm going to get in that. So I'm going to get something that's a little bit more reliable than what Ford has in that. So until next time.